But I bring to this reading of this story of Ruth the memory of my own mum, called Ruth, although in Dutch it's Rut, the memory of my own mum and some of the struggles that she had of being an immigrant in this country. Although because of the colour of her skin, people didn't know immediately she was an immigrant at all. It was only when you spoke to her that you knew and you got that impression. And my mum was quite dependent on the state when we were children, being on her own with 3 small children. We all lived on free school meals. I was educated in Bolton, and I'm very grateful for the education that I had. I had a full grant when I went away to university, and through my childhood, we always lived on benefits. So I'm really a product of the welfare state that I'm very proud of as well. But this does mean that I was amongst the poorest in society at the time, and fortunately was given the opportunity to flourish, particularly through school and education, and then through the life of the church as well. And all of these experiences are the experiences that I bring to a reading of the story of Ruth. So let's recap for a moment. Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, had suffered a number of significant losses, her husband and her 2 sons. And her 2 daughters-in-law had travelled some of the journey, but it's Ruth who stays with Naomi as Naomi wants to head back to Israel. And that means that Ruth herself is an immigrant, a Moabite who has left Moab in order to be with Naomi. So Ruth is a foreigner, an alien, according to the laws of the time. Not that she was green and had horns, but that she was an alien according to the fact that she wasn't from that land herself. So Ruth and Naomi have gone back to Israel. They've been welcomed, but there is no story of them being provided for or meals being given to them as women who've landed back in that place. And so Ruth takes up what is her right under the Hebrew law to glean. That is to gather up, after those who've harvested, all the bits that are left in order that she can gather enough food for herself and enough food for Naomi. And aliens had the right to do this, foreigners had the right to do this, in order that they could gather to provide for themselves and to provide a living for them as well, so that they weren't left destitute with nothing, and they actually could have food and survive. But it would have been a tough life, and it would have been a tough life for both of those women who were then not part of the social networks that were male-led at the time, and therefore nobody providing for them. When we read the laws of the book of Leviticus, where it tells us about all this gleaning, some of those laws are particularly strange when we read them with our 21st century eyes, and the laws can also seem quite harsh. But not so here. Here the law provides for the poor, for widows and orphans and aliens and immigrants, because it provides for those who have no way of providing for themselves. So the law makes provision by allowing people to glean, to gather up the leftover bits so that they have food. I want to tell you the story of Grace. Grace is the daughter of a Methodist minister. And she came to this country when she was just 18 years old with the rest of her family. She's the oldest child in the family. She came and she studied hard, worked for her A-levels, went on to university to study. And when she was approaching her second-year exams at university, she suddenly had to provide evidence of her immigration status for the university. And on the basis of that, she lost her place at university. Not that she was an illegal immigrant at that stage, but because the Home Office was demanding that she needed the immigration status in her own name and not that of her family anymore. She applied for that immigrant status, having never lived in Africa in her as an adult at all, but she was refused status by the Home Office. She was refused the leave to remain. She's appealed that a couple of times, the second time of which she had 10 character witnesses who went to court with her. A friend paid her court fees because it costs thousands of pounds actually to launch an appeal in this way, as does the application for leave to remain in the country. But still, she has not received a permission to be in Britain. Now imagine that. She's moved here with her family. Her brother is a British citizen. Her parents have leave to remain, and yet the Home Office is telling her that she has to go back to Africa. But she doesn't have a home in Africa. She's never lived there as an adult. She has no close family back in Africa. For her, it makes no sense to go. So now she lives. She's unable to earn a living for herself because she can't provide the right documentation for any employer. She's unable to claim benefits in this country because she's not entitled to anything. She could have emergency medical care. She's one of the most vulnerable people in our society. And it's just shocking, I think, that the Home Office think that this is an acceptable situation, that it's acceptable for people to live like this, that it's acceptable for people to be told to go to somewhere that they've never actually really lived other than as a child. So that's the story of Grace. She has no way of earning her own income. Sometimes we think the Old Testament laws are harsh, but actually, if you put that alongside what we as a Western society currently do to hundreds of people, at least in this society, then we can see what we're doing is actually providing less, because we're not saying to these people, come, you can find a way of providing for yourself through our harvest. What we're actually saying is, we won't give you anything at all apart from a ticket to a country where you have no roots at all and no real sense of history or worth or value. Imagine what that would be if somebody said that to you. So I pray that we have a system which is much more generous in this country, that we have a system that actually cares for people. And you can see the importance of things like the destitution projects that I've heard bits about at the Victoria Hall, for those who absolutely fall through the system through really no fault of their own in this society. Because somehow we say no to people, and in that we say no to providing even for their very basic of needs. Hugely, hugely difficult problem. So for me, there needs to be a change, a political will that says everybody deserves dignity. Everybody deserves respect. Everybody deserves the very, very basic things we need in life to thrive. The story of Grace is she was studying law. She would have made a fantastic lawyer. She's a very, very able person. And what this whole process has done to her is nearly destroyed her as a human being. And we, as a society, when we don't stand up against that, accept that situation is happening to people. And that makes me, well, it drives me absolutely crazy. So the society which Ruth found herself was actually more generous than our society sometimes is to people, because it allowed her a way to provide for her own needs and for those of Naomi as well. In our reading today, we meet the person of Boaz. And Boaz is really quite an interesting character. I think in some ways he's a good model for all Christian men. What does it mean to be a good Christian male? The church is not immune from harming other people. That's why I'm in a job as a safeguarding officer. And those of us who've worked in this field will know that that is the case and is true. At this year's Methodist conference, we launched a sexual harassment policy for the Methodist Church, because we know that there are women in particular, but not just women, sometimes men, sometimes people in same-sex relationships, or same-sex harassment happens as well. We know that there are people who are hurt and are harmed by the actions of others. And in the past, we found it sometimes very difficult to deal with these things as a church. I kind of just want to point you in the direction of that new policy. Have a look at it. Have a look at it if you're male. Think about your own behaviour in particular. Have a look at it if you're female and think about how many stories you know of your own examples in your own life where you have felt that harassment. What would you do now? What would you do now if you saw it happening to somebody else? I hope that the policy will give us confidence to respond better to those situations. I say better because it will take us a while to actually get some of these things right, I think, in the life of the church, because this is about a change of culture. But this isn't just a women's issue. This is about men and women. It's about how we all treat each other properly and well. And everybody and every man has a role to play. And I think, actually, reflecting on it, Boaz is actually quite a good role model for men of faith. Well, why do I think that? Well, if you look at what Boaz does, his first question is, who does this woman belong to? I would not suggest that you go up to any woman and ask her, who does this woman belong to? Because certainly in my case, if you ask me that, you'd probably get back the right knee of fellowship. That's to do with a time when women and the rights of women were very much tied to who their male was, in much more patriarchal society than ours is today. But there are other things that Boaz does that suggest that he was kind of safeguarding or looking out for the needs of Ruth and therefore Naomi as well. He tells Ruth, you can glean here, go behind the women, because he knew it was safer for Ruth to be part of the women's group. She was less likely to be attacked, less likely to be harassed by following the women. So he suggested to her, in the first place, a place of safety where she could do her work. The second one's to order the men not to bother Ruth, not to bother her, not to attack her, not to harass her. The language bother doesn't quite give it what it really, really means, which is attack her. So he also instructed them, you don't do this. He made it very, very clear what was unacceptable behaviour. He respected Ruth for her decision, the decision that she'd made to follow Naomi and to try and therefore provide for herself and Naomi through the gleaning. He respected her for the decisions that she'd made. He'd heard that she's a good person, in the situation that she was, thought that was a good decision. So he worked hard then to remove some of the obstacles to her survival, or her and Naomi's survival. For instance, he let her glean from the sheaves, not just the parts that had fallen to the floor, not just the grain that had fallen to the floor, and that would mean that Ruth would be more productive in what she collected. And he asked his servants to, pull out some of the bundles and leave them, especially for Ruth, and so that to make her job a bit easier again, to remove the obstacles to her survival. He gave her food to eat and did that alongside his ordinary servants, treating her as an equal, despite the fact that she was a foreigner. And he was therefore educating others in how to be properly hospitable. And so she stayed till the end of the harvest, and this meant that her and Naomi had some security at the time when they really needed it. And what does Naomi say when she finds out it's Boaz? Well, he is related, he is one of the family. And I can almost hear in that phrase Naomi's pride. Oh, well, he's done the right thing, our Boaz. Well, he's done the right thing by you. I like that line, feeling really proud for somebody who's done something really good. What is safeguarding? We talk about safeguarding a lot in the life of the church. Safeguarding for me is more than just safe from harm. That's really important that we prevent harm. But safeguarding is also about people being safe to grow. It's about enabling the whole of human flourishing. I therefore think that we have much to learn from Boaz's response to Ruth. We need to think very carefully as church and as society about our care for the poor and for each other. And we need to work for justice and to change lives and culture in the life of the church, to put an end to all that hurts and harms other human beings and each other. so that we are all safe to grow in God's name. Amen.